Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute's Policy Forum. Our topic today is Russia, the war in Iran, and the Middle East. I'm your moderator, Christian Caryl. I'm a columnist at Foreign Policy Magazine and a former Moscow bureau chief for Newsweek. Thanks a lot for joining us. Now, Russia has long been a major player in the Middle East, including as an ally of Iran and the Assad regime in Syria. But the region is rapidly changing in the wake of the Iran war, and so is Moscow's role. So we've got a lot to discuss about the Kremlin's strategy and tactics in the region, and we've got an outstanding panel to walk us through these complicated issues. First up is retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. He's a highly decorated former U.S. Army officer who served until December 2025 as President Trump's special presidential envoy for Ukraine. He served in the first Trump administration as senior national security advisor and assistant to the president, as well as national security advisor to Vice President Pence. General, thanks for joining us today. We're also joined by Anna Borshchevskaya, who is now the Harold Greenspoon Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, working in its Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation program on great power competition and the Middle East. Ooh, what a mouthful. Her research focuses on Russia's policy toward the region. She's the author of Putin's War in Syria, as well as a recent Washington Institute report called After Ukraine, Prospects for a Russian Resurgence in the Middle East. And that report was co-authored with Matt Tavares, our final panelist. He's a former Department of Defense official with 2 decades of experience in U.S. national security affairs. His current work in the private sector focuses on emerging technologies and the evolving nature of armed conflict. So without further ado, let's dive on in. So General Kellogg, I think we'd like to start with you first. We've seen a number of reports detailing Russian support for Iran during the Iran war. Some of the reports have said that the Russians have provided the Iranians with targeting intelligence, with military hardware, and help evading sanctions. So how should U.S. policymakers respond to these activities?
Well, I think the results are pretty damning for the Russians right now. Is when you look at about U.S. technology, what it's done in Iran against what happened to be the Russian technology, their best, the Chinese technology was best, we punched right through it. We didn't really have any problems militarily dealing with their defensive systems, which were predominantly came out from outside of Iran. So I would kind of look at it and say, well, if anything, I give you the bumper sticker. If you want to succeed, don't buy Russian stuff. And I think the policy advisors go, yeah, we know they're supporting you. Go ahead and do it. Your stuff's not very good. What you just proved is a negative, that your stuff's lousy, and good advanced technologies can beat it. So if I was a technology guy or a policy guy, I would kind of go, okay, they don't scare me at all. I'm not worried about them at all. I know they do it. They're not a friend, and go from there.
Very interesting. Am I on? Okay. Very interesting. Thank you for that, General. I was going to go to Anna next, but I think that question immediately bridges me over to Matt, who has a particular interest in technologies. Matt, I wonder if you could talk about that a little. In the report that you and Anna co-authored, you mentioned that Russia is actually still very present in the Middle East with arms sales and selling defense production. Somehow, Russia's problems in the Ukrainian war don't seem to have impacted its reputation as a supplier of military technology to the Middle East. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And so I would just say that most of the world's militaries do not size and shape their force to be able to defeat a combined Israeli and U.S. strike. So I think there's many cases in which Russian equipment, though it's cheap, though it's perhaps not very effective, is still very viable. And there are plenty of places in the world that would happily buy, an S-400 or an S-300, knowing that it's it's insufficient to the task of defeating U.S. air power. I think for many countries that don't have established air forces, ground-based missile systems are the only way that they can establish, airspace sovereignty and control. So I would say yes, sir. The United States and the Israelis achieved, absolute technological overmatch of the Iranian air defense network. But one of the things that I think it proved in a certain respect is the defense industrial base of Iran and Russia really, I think, and the military planners really understood how to defeat the United States long-term, and that in a war of attrition advantages them significantly. It's not clear that it's going to lead to success, but if you believe that you need to engage in a war of attrition, how do you, what kind of capabilities do you buy? Small capabilities that are easy to produce, things like the Shaheed, that can be launched with almost no footprint. The only way that you can identify it before it launches off the rack is maybe having, absolutely perfect satellite coverage or some kind of other system that's collecting overhead, and have a defense industrial base where it's sufficiently externalized so that if you get into a conflict with, say, the United States, you have a huge chunk of your supply base that's actually not in Iran, or is in Iran but is hard to identify in a trip. And I think that's what the Iranians are doing now.
Really interesting point.
Yeah,
General, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I've argued this is not going to be designed for a kinetic win targeting. It's going to have to be based on economics, because when the Iranians years ago came up with a defensive plan to fight the United States, which is called Mosaic, it was designed to be totally decentralized. And so you've got to say, okay, I understand you, I understand what you can do. We can bomb you back to the dark ages, that's fine. But it's not just going to be kinetic. You've got to approach it a different way. And hopefully the president's going to be doing that in the future. I think what this has done, though, is that when you look at Russia right now, even though they do produce a lot of stuff, people are going to look at them as a secondary player. The Chinese are a primary player, we're a primary player, and they're a secondary player. Why do I say that? Well, they rely on everybody else right now. They're relying on the North Koreans to provide them support. They're on people's support as well. They're doing a lot of other things. We're getting other allies in there. It shows that they can't do this on their own. And I would just advise anybody looking at it that, if you're betting on the wrong horse, if you bet on Russia.
Thank you very much for that, General. So, Anna, I would like to come to you now, and I'd like to mention the subject of the report that you and Matt authored. I do think it is a fascinating report, and it's based on the idea that there was a kind of, shall we say, easy consensus after the fall of the Assad regime that Russia had incurred this tremendous foreign policy defeat, and that, that would curtail its interests in the region for many years to come. And I think you and Matt very convincingly argue in this report that's a very myopic view. Could you talk a little bit about how Russia has maintained its presence in the region since the fall of Assad, and perhaps also mention the fact that you just got back from Syria, where you saw this in practice?
Sure. Is this on? Sure. And let me also tie some of the points that both General Kellogg and Matt made to answer your question, Christian. There's no indication that Russia is disengaging from the Middle East. And the fact of the matter is, when we take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what Russia is trying to do, it's playing a much more nuanced and sophisticated game in the region rather than banking on Iran alone. And that's why when it comes to Iran, I don't think anyone should have expected Russia to come to Iran's rescue. Frankly, I'm not even sure if the Iranian regime did either. It would have been bad for Russia to do too much to support Iran, because it would have alienated Russia's relations with the rest of the region. And so, to your point, Russia is engaging with everybody in the Middle East, not just Iran, even though its closest relationships were indeed tied to the Assad regime and to Iran. Now, with regard to Syria, again, yes, Russia supported Assad. Yes, they saved him from an imminent fall over 10 years ago, but it was never about Assad for Russia. It was fundamentally never even about Syria. It was about positioning Russia as a counterweight to the United States. And it was certainly more important than any one ruler of the Assad regime. What we have seen is that Russia has managed to retain a presence in Syria, with the fall of Assad. Now think about it, when we withdrew from South Vietnam, we lost our bases. Russia still maintains their bases in Syria. That tells you a lot about what kind of a long game Russia is playing in the region. And that's what this is about. This is a much more patient and nuanced approach that Russia is taking.
We just saw a Reuters report today that the Syrians apparently are building out this commercial relationship with Russia at the port where Russia has a very prominent presence. And I think that is great evidence of your thesis, right?
And in fact, we know very well that the Shara government, the current government in Damascus that overthrew Assad, made a deal with the Russians that if they abandoned Assad, there would be a place for Russia in post-Assad Syria. From a purely practical perspective, Syria cannot afford to disengage from Russia, and both sides know that.
Right. So General Kellogg, how do you think the Iran war has affected more broadly Russia's position in the Middle East? Does it create new opportunities for Russia? Do you see Russia as being kind of squeezed out of the game in the Gulf? Or do you think the war has created something that Putin can exploit?
Well, I think if you look at Russia and you assume they're the old Soviet Union and that they're a powerful player, when it comes down to the other people in the region, I think they look at them as a lesser power, as a regional power now, where the real powerhouse are the Chinese. And you look at Sub-Saharan, what they're trying to do in the Sub-Saharan and elsewhere, it's not really a first-class game by anybody. And I would say to the United States, as our policy planners, that, I wouldn't treat Russia basically as we used to treat the Soviet Union, that they're invincible. They're not. And that I think that you see the turn, basically Ukraine, and we're saying what Ukraine's able to do against the Russians right now, which is really not only fight them to a standstill, but you look at it, they're actually winning the fight right now by taking the fight to them. And so I think over time, maybe not today, maybe not even tomorrow, but over time people are going to say, I'm not sure this is the alignment I want to have. I maybe want to go to the Chinese, maybe want to go to the Indians, maybe want to go back to the United States. Now, economically, they do have business in there, but it's still, if you look at it proportionally, it's still well below ours into the future. And I just think that Russia, by backing Iran and what we're seeing with Ukraine as well, people will start to realize, senior policy people, they're not as tough as we thought they were, as important as they were. And I think that that's going to turn on them eventually. And I think, I'm surprised that Putin hasn't picked up on that. I mean, you'd think a guy would be at least a little bit smarter. Maybe his advisors don't want to tell him that. I think he's, as the old saying goes, he's spitting against the wind. So, I guess right now, as if I was a policy guy, I'd say we can easily pivot now to the Far East and start looking at China and turn to the Europeans and say, these guys are in your backyard. You pay attention to them. They're not as bad as we thought. You're a lot better than you guys think you are, and operate from that premise as well.
So does Russia, as you see it, still have a capacity to play the role of a spoiler? Maybe it can't dictate events, shape events the way that China can, but it can still make lots of trouble, certainly.
Well, I think when you say play spoiler, that's probably the role they can really play. I think they're not a primacy. They cannot go out and dictate policy. I think when you look at their real powerful structure is oil. That's what they're really a petrostate. And when you look at it militarily, they're not strong. Diplomatically, they're not strong. Economically, they're getting weaker by the day. And I think people refer to them. We've made the same mistake. We think that the Russians, we think back to the days of the 70s, that when you have the Soviet Union who are very powerful, they're not the Soviet Union. And Russia is not the force we thought they were. And we only started to see that, I think, 5 years ago when the Ukrainians, after we thought to ourselves, we said the Ukrainians will last all of 3 days, and we offered Zelensky a ride out of town, and he made that great comment, when you come, you'll see my face, not my back, and he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. When you saw that, because we all thought, including our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that the Russians would just roll over the Ukrainians in a matter of days, 3 days. And we're in the 5th year right now. and their advances have been very small. So I think over time we realized that they're a major player only because of their size, and they've got nuclear weapons. And the amount of nuclear weapons is what gives you pause. But if you took away their nuclear weapons, they would be, and I got a lot of trouble saying this, and I mean, really, they're really Vermont with nuclear weapons, you know.
Yes, one notices that in their Vermont-like attitude towards international affairs. I love the line, though. So Anna, what advantages, I think General Kellogg makes some great points, but what advantages does Russia still have to play in the region? You know, it's not only about weapons, of course.
Yeah, and by the way, I agree that today's Russia is definitely not the Soviet Union. This is a fundamentally different country, and I think they know that too. I think the Kremlin understands that as well. They're much more, specifically in the Middle East, as opposed to Ukraine, actually, Putin has been much more cognizant of his limitations. And that's why his approach to the region was more limited and more nuanced. He was not looking to replace the United States as a security guarantor. Rather, he was looking for a way to undermine our influence through multiple ways. And arms sales, of course, as we just discussed, is one of them, but it's not the only one. But the other side is that when we look at what the region wants and how the region is engaging with Russia, we have not, but taking sort of a broad stroke all across the region, the Middle East has not helped us isolate Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine in any meaningful way, and at best has been ambivalent towards Russia. If anything, ties with Russia over the last 4 years of the war have improved with certain countries, most notably, as we noted in the report, with the UAE and Turkey on trade that goes beyond military sales.
Yeah, the report is really great on that. I don't think that those relationships have gotten as much attention as they should have.
And even, you know, look at the crisis now that we've seen in the last several months. No Middle East states has fundamentally moved to isolate Russia. No Middle East state has reneged on any agreement with Russia. Rather, they continue to play the same careful game of making sure that they retain ties to all powers rather than risk isolating Russia.
Right. And Matt, I was very curious about one of the recommendations in the report was that one way to kind of keep this Russian influence at bay or counter it, if that's something that we indeed want to do, could be achieved by boosting Ukraine in the region as an alternative to, I mean, Ukraine, Russia, you write about in the report about how Russia supplies Syria with huge amounts of food, some of it from Russian-occupied Crimea. You know, that's a factor Russia can employ, but let's help Ukraine supply the region with food. Let's help Ukraine expand its relationships with all these Gulf states on drones and anti-drone, counter-drone systems and things. Is that sort of along the lines of what you would propose?
Certainly, that's one way. I think we're seeing that play out right now with Ukraine's outreach to the Gulf states to provide both drones and counter-drone technology after Iran's the period of Iran's attacks, which I would note, you know, have begun again. The ceasefire is now off, and drones are being flown by Iran. I think just this morning I heard about 8 flew over Jordan on their way or trying to get to Israel. So that is Ukraine, anyone that has known me for any period of time knows that I think that Ukraine can play a very important role in replacing Russian defense material assistance. Also, all of the things that Russia tends to use to continue to have access to its regional partners, namely, you buy a BTR or an infantry fighting vehicle, and it has to go into sort of long-term maintenance. You buy an airframe from Russia, they need to repair it. Many of those contracts tend to go to Russian companies or the Russian state in some way, shape, or form. And so if you can get Ukraine to take on those sorts of contracts and replace Russia in those ways, you sort of stop the momentum of the Russian relationship, particularly with a country like Syria, where most of its military right now, to the extent that there is a conventional part of its military, is supplied by Russian military equipment from the Soviet era and later.
You know, what Matt's saying is really good, because if you were sitting back now, most of those countries in the Middle East, actually in Europe, a while ago, they go from problem, they go A, B, C, D. If you go to A to Z right away, you start to realize they're going to realize that Ukraine is actually going to be a military and economic powerhouse. And that's the reason why I think I've said all along that we need to align ourselves closer with Ukraine, because people will start demanding things. The Chinese will try to get involved. They'll try to get Ukraine on their side. Because how can you not support an army of 800,000, which they will be? They've got technology, they iterate, and I've seen it. They iterate technology faster than anybody. I mean, and every 6 months they change it around. Our defense industries, you're lucky to get an RFP, request for proposal, out in 6 months, and they can iterate technology in 6 months. I mean, they build their drones, and I was at a hotel at a conference, and we had to do we're doing the conference in the basement. And as we took the escalator down on the second floor down, there was a drone factory. I mean, they build this stuff in the middle of nowhere. But it's something that we have lost by our innovation or slowness. And I think sooner or later, and I'll go back to what I said at the start, is the Gulf nations realize maybe that's where we want to go. And Zelensky's pretty smart about reaching out to the Gulf nations as well. And they've got money to put there. They now realize that maybe we spent a lot of time and effort with the Russians, and maybe that's not the way to go.
If I can follow up. Yeah, I absolutely agree that Ukraine is our best ally in helping counter Russia in the region, in the Middle East and beyond. And I think it shows this situation that we're seeing today shows that this war in Ukraine really is a global affair. There's no pretending that it's limited to Europe alone. And the fact that Zelensky reached out to the Gulf states, that he took advantage of this moment, highlights with stark clarity. It also shows what an incredible asset Ukraine is to the West, that it's not simply a victim of Russia's aggression, it is an important partner for European security. And having said that, if I may add, looking at where we are with the war in Ukraine, certainly we've seen Ukraine achieve a number of key tactical advantages. And who would have thought that 5 years into the war, this is where we'll be today? So who could have predicted this outcome? And yet at the same time, I wonder if the challenges that Ukraine is facing at the moment, such as shortages of manpower, and additional support on which from the West that Ukraine is deeply dependent on, whether or not that's going to be enough to tip the scales fundamentally in Russia's favor, whether or not there will be one side that is fundamentally on that level. And right now, we're not seeing that yet.
And Matt, perhaps you could also address this at a weigh-in if you feel so compelled. What happens if the war ends? Will Russia then be able to scale up its presence in the Middle East?
Yeah,
Take
absolutely.
advantage of that?
Well, thank you for that segue. When we wrote this paper, General Kellogg, you had just gotten in place, and there was a real opportunity for the war to end. And really the sort of impetus for Ann and I was, well, what if the war does end? What does it do to Russia's relationships in the Middle East? And I think I began to realize, somewhat analytically, that there were a series of advantages that Russia had created for itself in its war against Ukraine that would make it much more powerful than it is currently in the region. I would say, regionally speaking, Russia's relationships are suppressed. Its defense sort of outreach and the extent to which it's able to ship new arms and material to the Middle East is suppressed by its conflict against Ukraine. But when that ends, look at what they're doing right now with just drone technology. Essentially they're producing anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 Shahed-type drones a month. They launched just shy of about 60K drones at Ukraine last year. The Russian defense industry prior to the war was one of the primary arms of the Russian state in many of these countries. And so that corporate imperative that they have, it's also a diplomatic imperative, is going to come back, just as strong as it was, if not stronger than before. And they're building systems that have been perfected in combat. And they're building these systems, all of which are low cost. I think they're going to have a series of, there are countries right now that probably don't want to have a relationship with Russia or don't want to buy Russian equipment, who are going to be looking at what Russia offers after the war concludes and saying, we have to get this. It's way less expensive than the
Well, here's where there's a danger, and here's a danger that I've seen, and I've seen it in the government as well, is we assume that they're going to be stronger, get stronger as well. And I would say, I'd look at it realistically. They're not as good or as strong as people think they are. And they've just gotten weaker as time goes along. And under the current leadership, I think Putin's got a real problem, and figuring out what he's going to do into the future as well. And Ukraine has kind of stripped away their cover of invincibility and what they can do into the future, because a lot of the technology they're taking right now, they're basically from like the Shahed drones that came out of Iran. And it was not something they self-generated, as opposed to what the Ukrainians have done. And the Ukrainians have basically taken stuff they've got, like their Flamingo missile system. They built it homegrown. And now look what they're doing with it. They're striking really deep. So if we assume that Russia's going to be powerful in the future, it might have policymakers thinking, well, we need to really be concerned about the Russians. My position is, no, they're a regional power, and they're going to stay a regional power unless they can take Ukraine. The Chinese are the primary partner. They're the secondary partner. I mean, if they really were doing as well as they said they were doing, they wouldn't need North Korean troops on the ground. They wouldn't need North Korean assets to do it. And so I look at them right now as not the old primary power. And I will tell you, there's people, even here in Washington, D.C., in the White House, that look at them with an aura of invincibility. And I say, you shouldn't go there. And I don't think, my comment, Matt, is that we should not have a narrative that makes them stronger than they are, because it creates a fear in decision-making, because you rub your hands in a negative manner thinking they're stronger than they are. They're not.
Excellent point.
If I could actually build on that, I think that's a great point, and I agree with you, General. I think the danger that we had to deal with for the last 4 years is that we were afraid of doing too much to support Ukraine. We worried, had done just enough to ensure that Ukraine does not lose, but that's not the same as helping Ukraine win. And I absolutely agree, and I've argued myself over the years that we should not be afraid of Russia losing this war, that they're not invincible. In fact, they've lost wars in the past, historically, quite disastrously. But if you take a broader view over the last over 4 years, it is indeed that fear that oftentimes prevented us from doing enough to help Ukraine at these critical moments, like the moment where we are today. And I would also say that the issue right now is not that Russia is invincible, but simply that they're playing a different game than we are, and that they have longer time spans. They're not influenced. They're not concerned about elections. Putin doesn't need to worry about what's going to happen in November. And therefore, he doesn't need to be the best. He simply needs to outlast us. He simply needs to wait us out. And that, in fact, that has been his approach to this conflict all along.
Right, and I think, Matt, you were just making the point that Russia's definitely not invincible and definitely not the superior military power in the Middle East, but they have certain competitive advantages.
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
Cheapness. I mean, you of all people, General Kellogg, know how exquisite our systems can be. They can be very pricey, and the maintenance contracts can be very complicated. And then Russia comes in with these modified Shahed drones, and you can see how some governments might find that very attractive.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a competitive advantage that they can deploy to some extent.
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm trying to big up Russia here, one other competitive advantage that they have when it comes to arms sales is, they don't do any end-use monitoring. They do not care who they sell it to. And so the idea that these systems could be sold on the cheap to a country that ought not to have them, and then perhaps those systems could fall into the hands of a group that definitely shouldn't have them. I don't think we think about, a group like Al-Shabaab as having the ability to conduct precision strike against U.S. forces, but they easily could if they had a system like that, and they could, travel about 1,200 kilometers quite quickly. And so, for the challenge for U.S. policymakers, and I agree, Russia's not invincible, and I often was the guy arguing for, U.S. policymakers to not self-limit in our dealings with them. They're not, 10 feet tall, but they are standing up, and they do have some height, and we ought to appreciate what that height is in order to better develop policy options to counter it. One of those being, the only way for us to appropriately address Russia's defense sales to the region is to get engaged ourselves, to conduct acquisition reform and foreign military sales reform that allows us to be competitive in all the places we need to be competitive and ensure that a Russian system has plenty of competition.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. When you look at our defense industrial base, it's really gotten bloated, and it doesn't have the agility. It's probably our fault, meaning the United States. And you think that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Stephen Feinberg, coming out of Cerberus Capital, will pick up on that, because he used to have Diane Corse, who understands the defense base. And remember this comment before we went on the air, is I'd like to probably start my own defense company, because right now it takes forever. I mean, trying to get something through the process we have in State Department or DOD, it takes forever to do it. And the corporation's bottom line, because I've been in the corporate business where they look at the bottom line, what to make on the dollar, instead of getting something done in a hurry or cheap. And I think by us, for example, telling the Ukrainians we're willing to have them co-produce Patriot missiles, I'll tell you, in 5 years from now, if we were sitting right here, Ukraine may become the new Germany in defense production, or the new Poland as well, because they can develop stuff fast and cheap and sell it out there to buyers, and they won't supplant us because our technology is so good. But they can supplant somebody like the Russians because they can make it fast and they can make it good. I go back to when you look at technology, really, I think one of the reasons why Russia wants Ukraine is when you look back at their technology, that was the technological base of the nuclear power Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And he now realized that Ukraine, they've got the smarts to do this. And I think in the future, over time, they become, for lack of a better term, the Sparta of Europe, and they can export that experience, both in arms experience and defense experience, and something to supplant us. And when I said earlier about it's partially on us, we're the country that drew down from 31 defense companies to 5, and now you've got 5 defense companies. I mean, people don't realize that Lockheed Martin makes the Patriot, but Boeing makes the seeker heads on the PAC-3 missile. They only make 30 a month. They're on a 5-day work week. They're not now they're starting to go in a full wartime production, but we're just really slow on the uptake.
That's a fascinating point. I wanted to ask a little bit about Turkey, and I think I'd actually like to have all of you weigh in on this, because you addressed Turkey in the report, but there was a bit of news this week when President Trump said that he was willing to finally sell those F-35 jets to Turkey after so many years of American hesitation. And the source of that hesitation was the Turkish purchase of Russian weapon system. I mean, that was the only source of hesitation, but a big one, the purchase of Russian air defense systems, the S-400. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and whether that decision to let the Turks have the planes is a good way of perhaps also, I don't know, bringing Turkey over to our side, prying them away from Russia a little bit, with whom they, as you said in the report, have a really remarkably close relationship, even though they're a leading NATO member. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit. It's a thorny issue. But.
How about you take this one first, Anna? Or else I'll just immediately talk about S-400s the whole time. And
Thank you. Well, the one source of leverage I think we had, and I'm just taking a stab at this question, the one source of leverage that we had in influencing Turkey's behavior was incentivizing it to come back to the F-35 program, pending some conditions. I don't know all the details of this deal as of yet, but I'd be curious if Russia will still get to have the S-400 in the country, and certainly that's its own question for me. But by and large, I don't disagree that Turkey should be readmitted into the program, pending that there's a certain change in behavior.
Yeah, I get worried about selling the F-35 to Turkey, because somebody will reverse engineer it and get the stealth technology that we don't want out of our hands. And I understand that, when you sell like a foreign nation or one of our piece of equipment, we call it the vanilla version. It's never the first-rate version, but it's still technology, and you can still reverse it. You've got the S-400. You can kind of fine-tune it. So I'm very concerned, because when it gets out of our hands, not to the Western nations of Europe, but when you get into the Middle East or you get it to Turkey, I'm not absolutely convinced, and I think Congress feels the same way, that technology out of our hands, you're going to reverse technology, and all that time we spent, you know somebody's going to try to buy it or try to sell it, because especially after what they've proven, what they do with the B-2s and the F-35s on Midnight Hammer and Striking Deep, that they weren't picked up at all. So I think even though that they did, now give the Turks, full credit in this regard, they have bought those airplanes. Those airplanes are sitting at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Not Davis-Monthan, they're sitting out in Arizona right now at Luke Air Force Base, sitting in mothballs. But they actually own 6 aircraft because they bought them. And now the question is, do we release that technology, knowing what we know, what's happened in the recent war? I'd be very cautious about that. I think Congress has a reason to be.
So do you expect some congressional resistance to that move by President Trump?
Expect it or no? I know there's going to be congressional resistance because they've already made major concerns about it, and I'm sure there's somebody out there thinking the same thing. They've already put restrictions on selling those, and Turkey's I believe, been a great ally. But when you look at the leadership, Erdogan's older. He's going to be replaced by somebody. We know the the Russians and the Chinese have influence in that part of the world. And that'll be a diamond in the rough to try to get that technology. And I would just be very concerned about letting go of that technology other than the Western countries, which have that, because I'm comfortable the Poles, the Germans will protect that technology much better than other states.
You were going to add something?
Well, I'm never one to sort of argue Erdogan's case here, but since everyone has argued one position, I'll take the other just for the sake of making an interesting argument. So I don't, Erdogan bought the S-400 in part to protect his own life. He's not, if you're seeking to protect your own life, what are you going to do? You're going to buy the system that the rest of your NATO-compliant military does not use. And so I think over the last perhaps 15 years, there's a lot of trepidation in the U.S. military about the S-400, what it could do technically, what it could see, and then I think what it could potentially pass back to the Russians about our ability to maintain stealth. I think, like you said, we've had a series of successes against, Russian air defense systems, and some of our allies have had some success against Russian air defense systems. I think some of that fear has eroded somewhat. The S-400 is no longer the boogeyman, and I think I would say if you roll back the clock about 10 years, I was the guy saying we have to figure out a way to address this S-400 because it's boxing out the United States in all of these core areas where we need to engage. And I think Trump probably has made the policy decision that Turkey's too important of an ally to allow the S-400 to impede that relationship. Whether or not it's the right call, only time will tell.
Can I make a follow-up comment on that, if I may? Even this conversation that we're having right now highlights the challenge to me of how do we deal with Russia and how do we craft policy to address Russia's influence. Because the very fact that we're having a hard time grappling with this question shows how hard it has been to isolate Russia on the global stage. And we can talk a lot about Russia's limitations. But Russia is still creating problems for us, and that's the policy challenge, and that's why it's so difficult.
Anna, could you talk a little bit about Russia and the UAE? We just talked about Turkey. That, for me, is really one of the surprising chapters of this story. How much the UAE has sought Russian cooperation in a number of areas, and even if we entirely accept General Kellogg's point about the inferior quality of Russian weapon systems and the limits on what Russia really has to offer, then that relationship with the UAE becomes kind of even more surprising. The UAE can buy any technology they want, in terms of affordability, right? They can afford any technology that people are willing to sell to them. Why has the UAE, of all countries, been seeking out this collaboration with Russia? It's a really good example of the problem you're describing.
Yeah, and the problem is that UAE was willing and able and interested in engaging with Russia on the commercial side. The biggest challenge we had with the UAE is purchasing of so-called dual-use technology. that helped Russia in its war effort in Ukraine. Certainly, the UAE, along with other countries, did not join sanctions against Russia, and therefore the UAE was not constrained by the sanctions regime. And the issue here is that UAE, like other countries in the region, did not want to antagonize Russia, did not want to isolate Russia, and there were direct benefits to them. So they were playing also a careful game in this war, like everybody else. So when we talk about why are we here, this is now year 5 of this war, the biggest war since World War II.
The war in Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine, that's right, the war in Ukraine. The war that's now become a global affair, as we discussed. Why is it that Russia is still able to fight this war? Well, a key reason is that Russia still has the resources to do it. Why does Russia have the resources to fight this war? And that's because countries like the UAE were willing to engage with Russia. And until Russia runs out of resources, they're not going to stop fighting.
Fascinating. General Kellogg?
Well, here's a question I think needs to be asked is, based on what's happened in Iran and Iran attacking their neighbor states, UAE is an example recently, with the attack, well, maybe it's even Jordan right now. The question is, are the Gulf states going to say, you guys supported these guys? Your influence helped them be able to strike us as well. Maybe their influence will start to go down as a result of the Gulf War. And when you look at the Emiratis, who are very good fighters, they've always supported us in the past, are saying with MBZ, saying, well, maybe this is the guys we don't want to associate with into the future. And maybe you don't cut it off, go cold turkey, but you basically say, we're not going to be as supportive as we were in the past because they're helping these guys to our north, Iran, and basically Iran keeps shooting missiles at us. Thank you very much. Russia, you've been on the back, been siding with them, and they have not turned off their support right now, Russians to Iran. So, it's, you're looking at the friends of my friends, the enemies of my enemies, who are these guys really supporting? So I think maybe not tomorrow, but over time they're going to say they're going to rethink their policy well into the future where Russia goes in supporting basically adversaries that they're facing on a daily basis now.
So your story is really, the war in Ukraine has put a gigantic dent in Russia's reputation as a quote-unquote great power, and the war in Iran is merely going to deepen that dent. Do I understand you correctly? And
yeah, I think if I had to put it on a bumper sticker, you're right. I think the fact is that if you look at the past 5 years ago, that everybody assumed that the Russians would roll over them in a matter of days. When you look at the Middle East, you look at the ability of Russian equipment not to defeat our equipment and our allies' equipment going in there. And you start to question, are these the right guys we want to associate with? Maybe we want to associate more with the Chinese, or maybe with the United States or somebody else. Because I think in policy circles, the reason why there's hesitation, and you said, Anna, that you're looking at them because of their nuclear capacity. You're not looking at them otherwise. But I think you may have to make decisions based on what they can do with their nuclear base, which is enormous. I just think over time, maybe not tomorrow, but over time it's going to start to erode their confidence of the neighbors and maybe with the UAE, with Russia as an ally or a supporter.
I think you do have to wonder about that. Anna, I see you champing at the bit there.
Well, no, I would very much like to see that scenario play out in the region. I think we all would like to see that scenario. I think that's all we could agree on. I also hope that if we can support Ukrainians more in this region, as well as provide other alternatives, viable alternatives to Russia, that will help speed up that scenario materializing. As of yet, I have not seen this fundamental shift. And to give you one example, Russia is still one of the bidders on Saudi Arabia's nuclear power program. Saudi Arabia is in the process of working to build its first commercial nuclear power plant, and Russia is one of the bidders, and this has happened after this war. So that's another example of how the Gulf states are not looking to disengage from Russia. And as far as as far as the broader picture, I think now one other thing to point out is that when it comes to Russia, certainly its nuclear capabilities are critical. It's very important, and we shouldn't take that lightly. And it is absolutely a major player in the energy field. But Russia is also one of the world's top producers of fertilizer. And when you look at what unfolded with the war in Iran, Russia has positioned itself, again, more thinking long-term, as somebody that will essentially feed the world if there's a food crisis. And so Russia is a lot more than only a country that sells oil and gas.
Oh, yes.
that's
So
something.
I see in some cases, so the UAE is one example of this trend, but, you know, for countries that don't necessarily change power every 4 years, the whipsawing around of U.S. foreign policy can seem like a challenge that they need to address. And so many of the Gulf states and countries in the region view the United States as, you know, you can call us capricious, you can call us, but we're a democratic country and we change our minds every now and then. And in some ways, this can have dramatic impact to those states. And so, you know, pursuing a relationship with China or Russia, particularly if you need, you know, defense material, is a smart move. It's hedging and
Diversification.
Yeah, they're diversifying their suppliers, and that can be very useful when, you know, you want to do something that the United States or the West might object to. And so I don't think that the UAE is planning on doing anything like that. They've been a wonderful partner to the United States for many, many years. But I think from their perspective, it's just a smart foreign policy and national security concept that they're putting into action.
Anna, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, which is another really interesting case. I mean, we've seen the Saudis make this mutual defense pact with the Pakistanis. We've seen them establish a lot of ties with China, sometimes in rather surprising ways. So they are clearly involved in this diversification strategy. How far are they going in their relations with Russia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has also played a careful balancing act here, and I think this goes to Matt's point just now, is that all of these countries, and Saudi Arabia is one of them, want to make sure that they have a diversified foreign policy. They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket and bet only on the United States. This is not to diminish America's role, but countries like Saudi Arabia, for Saudi Arabia in particular, it was Russia's oil in the energy market and Russia's role in OPEC plus.
Right, we haven't mentioned OPEC plus
Exactly.
yet. You mentioned that in the report.
Exactly, and one way or the other, we do know that Russia will remain an important player in the energy field, and I think Saudi Arabia knows that as well, and therefore they're also playing the long game here.
Fascinating. General, did you want to say something about the Saudis?
Well, here's, again, it's a cautionary note, is
Sure.
I think we haven't seen results of what's happened after the Mideast war and also with the war with Ukraine. And Anna made a good point, is I'm stunned by that war. It's the longest war in Europe since World War II. But the losses alone of the Russians are astronomical. I mean, you know, if you lose between 1.2 and 1.4 million dead or wounded, as the Russians have, and they left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. I mean, you have to go to we don't know what the next 1 or 2 or 3 years down the line could look like. But I would, especially MBS is what he's doing right now with in Saudi Arabia, what he's trying to do, I think he's trying to make it more, for lack of a term, when it comes to the Middle East, with a small d, more democratic. And I think he's going to rely on the United States' help to do that. But I think Anna's right. I think they're hedging their bets. That's just what you see in the Middle East. And from being there, I know the problems they're going to have as developing things. And I think there's going to be some counterweights as years go by. I mean, 1 or 2 years. And I think we're going to look at Russia eventually, maybe not in our lifetime, but in a few years as a regional power, not a global power. I mean, they're going to be always a global power because they're nukes. But when you look at their influence, there's going to be people are looking other places. And again, that's the reason why we try to pivot the Chinese, because they're going to be so important. The Indians are going to be important. The Ukrainians are going to be important as well. I think the arc of security has moved more to the east than to the west. Meaning it used to be Great Britain, it used to be Germany, it used to be France. Now that arc has moved to the Scandinavian countries, Ukraine, Romania, places like that. So it's moved further to the east. So you hate to say it, it's an old cliche, but only time will tell.
So Anna, I hope this isn't too far out of left field. You don't really talk about this very much in the report, if I remember correctly, but could we just touch upon Israel and its relationship to Russia? Because that has struck me over the years as a very strange and kind of fraught relationship. Sometimes it feels like they're coming a little bit closer together. You know, Israel has definitely not supported Ukraine in the war. And on the other hand, they don't really seem to be actively cooperating. I mean, Israel is a part of the Middle East. How can we characterize that relationship in a few words?
Yeah, in a few words, I think this is a relationship that Putin cultivated personally, and he took a special approach over the years, over 20 years that he's been in power, and that comes from learning from a lot of failures of the Soviet Union. Now, we talked a lot about Russia not being a Soviet Union, and Putin, I think, is one person who knows that very well, and that's why people like he and his circle have studied the failures of the Soviet Union, and if they made mistakes, they certainly make new ones, but not the ones that the Soviet Union made. And so one of the things that KGB officers have concluded is that isolating Israel has not achieved the Soviet Union the advantages that they were looking for. Fundamentally, from a practical purpose, it did not achieve what they wanted. So this relationship has been also one of nuance and complicated effort to maintain good ties. Neither side is looking for a bilateral crisis, and I think that's the crux of the issue. But Israel there were two issues. One is Russia still has a Jewish population, and Putin never fails to remind that to Israel and the rest of the world. And up until recently, Russia was in Syria. Frankly, that is still a factor to post-Assad Syria as well. And so you see Israel looking at Syria through that lens of a balancing power within Syria, which is right on its border.
All right. Thanks very much for that. So I think we still have a little time, yes? General Kellogg, I mean, you are very admiring of the Ukrainian effort, and I wonder what you think about, I think we can add a little Tabasco at the end to our Bloody Mary here. I think we've been very dutiful and we've covered everything. So let me ask you a bit of a quirky question. What do you think about the Ukrainians engaging the Russians in the Sahel and in northern Africa? We just had some news coming out of Mali in the past few days where, the Tuareg resistance in Mali, supported by the Ukrainians, gave the Russians another black eye. The Russian forces in North Africa, wonderfully called the Africa Corps, as if that didn't resonate historically. Are the Ukrainians wasting effort by trying to, mix it up with the Russians in North Africa? I've heard some people kind of say that, but do you think it makes sense for them to do that with all their limited resources?
I would, if I had a preference, I'd say focus on Russia, where you're at right now, instead of taking any assets and moving them elsewhere out there. But this is where I give them credit for. They really do go out of their way to, aggressively, strategically, do things that they're out of the norm. If most of us would say, focus in on your backyard right now. You got enough problems going on right now, instead of going into Africa. But I think that's a way of expanding influence. And they've got some very good strategic thinkers in Ukraine, and watching what they're doing and be able to talk to them. They're still based a little bit on the old Russian bureaucracy, but they're starting to think on their own, do things on their own. But you're answering the short question. I would prefer they stay at home, do it. But I tell you, I think to embarrass the Russians, they're happy about doing it, and I think that's kind of their attitude.
They're just really eager to mix it up with the Russians, right?
They are.
Yeah. Well, so I think we're nearing the end of our discussion. Anna and Matt, maybe we could kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that surprised you when you were doing this research. You were looking into this region with fresh eyes, going really deeply. What do you think is, maybe not what surprised you, but what do you think are the most surprising things that emerged from your report?
Well, I would just say that, as an analyst, I have a series of impulses and things that I tend to fall back on. One of them is if a foreign policy situation or national security situation appears to be turning our America's way to just implicitly reject that because it prevents me from seeing all the other things that are moving. And for a country like Russia, they're a highly adaptive competitor and potential adversary, and they have plenty of tools in their toolkit. I really think, I spent much of my time in government fretting over Hammeimim and Tartus and what the Russians were able to do there. The reality is that, you could lose both of the Russian bases in Syria, yes. Both of those facilities, the Russians could lose them tomorrow, and they still have plenty of opportunities to set up bases elsewhere that are going to allow them to continue to exist in the region for some time. And so the things that Russia has experienced in terms of their, losses in Syria would cause Washington, D.C. to fret for, we'd be doing, the president would be full of angst about all of these things. The Russians were just able to walk it off.
Excellent point.
There was no, nobody really seemed to care very much back in Moscow that Assad was now living in Russia, and that many of their positions had been lost, and they just pivoted quickly to other partners that were willing to engage with them. And I think, the real lesson for the United States is that when Russia appears weak, don't use that as an opportunity to take your eyes off the prize. You have to keep watching them because they're going to continue to surprise you with their ability to pivot, make shrewd, foreign policy decisions, and do so more quickly than the United States and perhaps some of our Western allies fully appreciate.
What a great answer. So, Anna, what would you say?
Oh, well, at first I think that was an excellent answer, and I fully support what Matt just said. To build on that, I would just say that Russia has a long history of rebounding from losses. And exactly to Matt's point, Russia often surprises us. And I think it's important to have a degree of humility when approaching this country. Certainly anything can happen, anything is possible, and Russia has shown that certainly anything can happen in this country. But the history of rebounding from losses, being able to build ties with adversaries, for example, the Taliban. Russia has now recognized the Taliban, a historic, one of the most anti-Russian groups out there. It helps explain exactly why, and what Matt was saying, that they're able to walk these things off. They're able to shrug it off, and we can't. And therefore, I would invite us to take the long view on Russia. And that is exactly what the purpose of the report is. We're not looking at it from a day-to-day basis. We're looking years down the line. And I would conclude by saying that no matter how the war in Ukraine ends, we're going to be facing with a very angry, hostile Russia that will not repent for this crime, and this is a crime. So one way or the other, Russia will be a challenge for us, and we cannot take our eyes off the ball, exactly as Matt said.
Great point. General, closing word?
Well, I think part of this, and going about what Matt was saying, is we have a bad habit, Americans, is kind of reinforcing bad habits, meaning we shouldn't keep crediting the Russians as being this enormous power. It's going to stay a power. Instead, psychologically, we say, yeah, you guys are second rate. You're third rate. And I think that psychologically it hurts them as well. And they really are. When you think about what they've done compared to Europe, what's happening with the European nations and building up, Ukraine building up, well, don't think we should be concerned about Russia, both politically or economically. They're strong, we know, because it's a petrostate, or militarily. And we always kind of make this narrative, or we create this narrative that, well, they're really stronger than we think they are. They're going to be strong in the future. And I would say turn the narrative on its head. Say, no, they're not at all. You guys are a regional power. You're not going to be a superpower again. You are only because of your nuclear weapons. And their oil. You could shut that down in a heartbeat. If you wanted to, if you enforced a policy of shutting down the shadow fleet, they couldn't sell their oil anywhere. They'd have a major problem. And we haven't done that at all. So when you look at things like the sanctions we've got on them that are high, but the enforcement's about 1 to 10, if 10's being the sanctions, 3's being the enforcement. And so I'm one of those guys who came out of college thinking the Soviets were 10 feet tall, and now I realize they're not 10 feet tall as the Russians out. They have a great history. We know that. But I think Putin as a leader. I think he's more worried about being the current Nicholas II. Somebody's going to shoot him. And I think, when they came out of, when you look at the last czar, he came out of a loss to the Japanese. And what they had to survive as a result of that, that became the Treaty of Portsmouth with Teddy Roosevelt basically propping him up. So I'm not one of those guys who's going to say, rub my hands in a negative manner and worry about the Russians. I'm concerned about them, but right now I think we and our allies are a lot better than they are right now.
Well, that's a fascinating counterpoint to some of the other things we were saying here today. I really like the fact that we had a diverse discussion and that there were some different viewpoints that got thrashed out. So I'm very grateful to you, General Kellogg, for coming today. Anna, Matt, thank you so much for taking part, and thanks for a fantastic report. I would highly recommend it to everyone. Even if you don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions, I think it's important. There are important arguments there that people really need to take on board. So thanks very much to everyone, and thanks very much to our audience for listening in.